last winter, I was at the auto show with my best friend, and we were looking through all the cars, and I came across this booth of people looking with no cars, and I thought, well, what is this booth? And at the booth, I realized it was Consumers Energy, and I said, what is, like very naively, what is Consumers Energy doing at an auto show, right? And so I started asking some questions, and I realized, oh, they're here educating the public about electric vehicles and how to plug them in and charge. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So as Carl and I started talking, I said, you know what, as it turns out, I would love to have you come to GRCC and talk to us about this in the math seminar. And so that was awesome. We made that connection, and you're seeing the result of that here today. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you Karl Bloss and talking about Consumers Energy and their role in electric vehicles. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. All right, thanks. Well, thanks for coming. So my background is actually academic. I'm a chemical engineer by training, and then I stopped that career and started getting into EV outreach. I'll tell you a little bit how that happened. I worked for Bayer, like the aspirin. So I got a chance to go on an expat assignment, lived in Germany from 2011 to 2014. And even back then, the price of diesel, and this is the diesel vehicle we bought, was a Volkswagen Touran, which they don't export to the US. It's basically a Golf body. So it's the TDI before the whole TDI scandal. Because the price of diesel, even back then, was around $8 a gallon equivalent. So it was pretty expensive. So you typically found these tiny little 1.3, 1.2 liter turbo diesels. And then we took a trip to London as an expat. You do this, you go on trips around Europe, and everything was running on diesel at the time. So the buses, the taxis, the private cars, and at the end of the day, you kind of have this film on you, and even, not to get too gross, but you blow your nose, you got black stuff, and it kind of made me rethink diesels. Like, maybe this is not that great of a solution after all. So let's talk a little bit about basics of vehicles, of combustion vehicles, how that all works, and what does it cost to run. So without getting too much into the weeds, the cars that we mostly drive today are run by an internal combustion engine, or ICE, or we call them ICE as well. They're fairly complex, but we've gotten really good at this because this is 1800s technology. There are 10,000 plus moving parts, lots of gears and pulleys and belts and shafts and whatnot. So we've gotten to the point where obviously now we can get them to 100, 200,000 miles with pretty good reliability. So what makes it go is still the liquid fuel. So we talk about gasoline. I kind of use that interchangeably, gas, diesel. And from an energy standpoint, a gallon of gasoline has about 33 kilowatt hours of energy. And when you work in the utility field, you kind of understand kilowatt hours a little bit. And if you've ever read your electricity bill, you kind of start to figure out, like, my house runs on about 24 kilowatt hours of energy per day. It's a condo townhouse, so it's nothing huge. But if you think about that, so a gallon of gasoline could run my house, if it was 100% efficient, for more than a day. So that's a pretty impressive energy density. And that's really why we use this, because that energy density makes that such a good fuel. Now, unfortunately, just through thermodynamics and other losses, the amount of energy that actually makes it down to the wheels to move that vehicle ends up only being about 20% of that energy in that gallon of gasoline. And that has largely to do with the thermodynamics of an internal combustion engine. There's only so much we can tweak out of it. And one of the ways you can always spot inefficiency is heat. Anytime you have heat, and through losses, you plug in your cell phone charger, it gets warm, that's a loss. That's an energy that's not going into your cell phone. So if you notice, this is a typical internal combustion engine vehicle. So you got a big grill on the front. And if you look at a fairly modern EV, you notice there isn't much. There's a little bit of an air inlet there, but you don't have a giant radiator rejecting all that heat. So that's where a lot of that energy goes. So along come battery electric vehicles. And by the way, this is nothing new. If you fancy bed and breakfasts, go up to Ludington sometime. There's a place called the Cartier Mansion. And Kate Cartier drove a 1917, I believe, Detroit Electric. So those cars have been around for a while, But the battery technology at that time, lead acid, wasn't really all that great. And also kind of fun, they have one room in their bed and breakfast that has a map of charging stations from the 1915 or so in Chicago. So that technology was there, but it kind of lost out to Henry Ford and the popularity of the Model T. So it's very simple. Motor efficiency is very high. There are very few moving parts. And really, it's all about the battery technology that's kind of brought us to where we are now, where the GM had the EV1, which initially was lead-acid batteries, but because of the energy density, it really couldn't go very far for practical purposes. So now we're in the 2010s, 2015s. So now we're starting to see energy density of batteries going up with lithium-ion battery. And this picture on the lower right here is the cutaway of a Tesla Model S. And you know, if you know those vehicles, they have a front trunk, a frunk as we call them, because you don't need any of that space for an engine. And before I forget, if anybody needs to leave early, we actually brought a vehicle here. One of my colleagues is out in the, what did you call it? The alleyway. So we brought our company F-150 Lightning, which is an electric pickup truck. And it has a frunk with a cooler, and like you open this thing, it's like, where's the engine? That's what I always get the questions. And the answer is, it's right here. They're packaged relatively small, maybe about the size of a watermelon. And so you don't need that same space. And the battery pack tends to be at the bottom. It's called a skateboard platform, keeps the center of gravity very low. So that's kind of where we're at in the technology. And if we do the same energy analysis, we find that much more of that energy that goes into the vehicle actually comes out as motion. And this is really where the savings come in. So if you look at on a BTU or per kilowatt hour on an energy basis, more of that energy is used to move that vehicle down the road than it is for a combustion engine, which is why, and we're going to do a little bit of math here, you'll see that it's respectably cheaper to run an electric vehicle just because of the fuel. So it's a math, so we got to do a little bit of math, right? And I took some round numbers here just for easy math. How much energy does it take? So we're going to look at gallons first. So if you assume $4 a gallon, and I know it's a little bit cheaper right now, and you assume 25 miles per gallon, so that's in the miles in the denominator, so that these cancel out, so you get dollars per mile. And it turns out with those numbers, and again, if you drive a Prius, maybe it's 50 miles per gallon. It's going to look a little differently, but this is the American average right now in the fuel efficiency standards. It's about 16 cents per mile. Okay? So if you do the same thing for electric energy, right now, if you are a consumer's energy customer and the cheapest nighttime rate that we have overnight is about 14 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's with all of the little fees and distribution and everything built in. That's the all-in cost. And this is a number you probably don't recognize, and that's the efficiency of an electric vehicle. And it's usually expressed in miles per kilowatt hour. So again, I put it on its head. And in some vehicles, they do use watt hours per mile, where it's, again, an inverse. Very similar. But this is a typical efficiency, 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. So then you come out with 4 cents per mile, and this is for home charging. So you see here, you're about a 4-to-1 difference, right? And now, when you go to a public charging station, and I'll have a graph on the next slide, it's typically a little bit more expensive, and that's because somebody's had to put in one of these fairly expensive charging stations, and they need to recover some of their costs, and there's profit and all that sort of thing. So maybe it's 36 cents per kilowatt hour. That's what Electrify America charges right now. So again, if you do that same math, now you're looking at 10 cents per mile for public charging. So either way, it's still cheaper than driving gas, at least with these numbers. Again, if you drive a Prius, maybe this is 8 cents per mile. But you can kind of see the ballpark of what we're talking about here. So if you drive 12,000 miles per year, so that's 1,000 miles a month, that's about what you get when you lease a vehicle. So the potential savings between these two lines is about $1,400. So this is why it gets interesting really quickly. Like, okay, if we talk about the environment, that's another discussion. I'll have a slide about that. But just purely from a cost perspective, it's much cheaper to drive electric. And what's cool about that is a lot of things that we do, we have the option to do now. have what's called a green premium. If we do something that's a little bit more environmentally friendly, maybe we have to pay a little bit more to get there. But for EVs, at least for operation of EVs, that's not the case yet. Now, purchase price is another topic. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if we put this in chart form, a typical fill-up, this is a question we get a lot. How much does it cost to fill up? Which is actually a little bit weird because the way you drive EVs, you typically don't really fill them up. You don't wait until it's 10% and then charge it up to 100%. You drive what you need to. My wife is up and about driving around today, and I think she'll come back with a 60% of the battery remaining. We typically charge it to 80% just because lithium-ion batteries are happy not to be at 100%. So we're only charging 20% of the battery. So you can't really call that a fill-up. But if we did that, this is about what it costs to charge up a Chevy Bolt EV, so a light-duty vehicle for about 200, 250 miles of range. And if you charge during peak periods when the energy is more expensive in the middle of the day in the summer, this is about what it would cost you, about $16 for public level 2 charging. It's a little bit more. Again, some places need to recover that energy, and some of them are free, by the way, and this becomes a game in the EV community. I live in Muskegon, and the downtown chargers are all free because the municipality wants you to come in and spend money at the coffee shops and microbreweries, and they want you to come to the beach and all that sort of thing. So it's kind of a game. And then you have this DC fast charging. That's the one I mentioned before, where this is, and I'll talk about charging levels in a minute. If you're on a road trip, clearly charging for hours is not acceptable. You need to be able to charge in terms of in a time frame of minutes, and that's what DC fast charging does for you. And I'll talk about that technology. And then again, compared to 25 mpg, I used 360 here. Sorry, it's not the same as the last slide, but you kind of get the idea. If it was $4 a gallon, it would be 40. So this is, if you drive mostly using home charging, you're going to save the most money. If you're a road warrior, the savings are not going to be quite as good. So where does electricity come from? I've heard this argument that, well, it's really just a long tailpipe, right? Because you're plugging into a fossil fuel grid. And while that's true, because of the efficiency of EVs, even if you power them from fossil fuels, they're still more efficient. They're more environmentally friendly because you're using less of that fossil fuel. And as time goes along, I copied this from our clean energy plan slides. Consumers Energy, at least, is intending to go coal-free by 2025. So this little gray block goes away. In transition times, we're looking at natural gas for a bridge fuel. And then over time, we want to build out more and more renewables. So in other words, the longer you drive, the more environmentally friendly it gets. And we also find that EVs tend to be a gateway drug to solar. So if suddenly you start understanding how much energy you're using, your energy using at home, all of a sudden you're like, well, you know what, I should look into solar panels for my house. So that happens more than you would think. So the other thing is maintenance is significantly reduced. So all this stuff that you see in the auto parts aisle, most of that you don't need anymore. So you don't need oil changes or oil filters. There's no engine coolant. There's no intake air filters. There's no spark plugs, ignition wires, belts, hoses. There's no exhaust. Brake wear tends to be significantly reduced. If you've ever driven a hybrid, you know this effect. You take your foot off the accelerator, and the electric motor that's driving the wheels now turns into a generator, takes some of that energy and puts it back into the battery. Now, it's not 100% efficient, but it's at least enough to make a difference, and it makes a difference on the brake pads as well. I sold a 2015 Tesla Model S to a friend of mine when I upgraded. Had 125,000 miles, still had its original brake pads. So these are things that you don't have to do them as often. There is still maintenance. The brakes, you still have to clean them. You got to get the grit out of them. We're in Michigan, there's salt, all that kind of thing. You do still need wiper blades. You need the cabin air filter to fill the air that comes into your climate control system, and tires. EVs are a little bit heavier by and large, so your tire wear is going to be a little bit accelerated, but not significant. The tire companies have stepped up and have already are bringing out EV-friendly tires that have much longer wear. So let's talk about disruption. So there's a guy, Tony Seba. You can look it up on YouTube. He put this slide out here in a video. New York, 1900, Fifth Avenue, where's the car? So there's one car, and the rest is all horses and carriages. Okay? And they did a similar picture. It's not exactly the same spot, but Fifth Avenue, 1913, there's one horse. The rest is all cars. And so, we think this stuff is coming very slowly, but the fact is, if you look at technology adoption, it typically goes through an S-curve. So if you look at the timeline on the bottom and the percent adoption rate on the y-axis, what you find is early on the telephone, electricity, cars, radio, refrigerators, they had a certain adoption. So you have early adopters that will get into it no matter what the cost because they just want it, it's cool or whatever. And then all of a sudden there's an inflection point where your neighbor has one, your friend has one, and it becomes more mainstream, and all of a sudden, boom, it takes off, right? And what we're finding is, recently you have things like the PC, cell phones, internet, digital cameras, MP3 players, social media. All of that stuff is much faster than it used to be. And that's kind of what we're seeing with electric vehicles. And here's that inflection point. So these are numbers from the Secretary of State. These are EV registrations, so it took a long time to get to that first million, and then all of a sudden, million in the US, and then this is the Michigan portion of this, so it's kind of ambling along, and then something happens, it becomes cheaper, again, your neighbor has one, suddenly it becomes more interesting. We had a discussion earlier, somebody has a hybrid and they're like, okay, I understand, now maybe I want to go to the plug-in hybrid. So that's kind of what we're seeing, right? So we're seeing this inflection point and it's really starting to take off. So let's talk about where do you charge? So this idea that we have to replace all gas stations with electric charging stations just doesn't pan out because as it turns out, 80+% of charging happens at home. By the way, this is my wife because we couldn't find a model that we can, we couldn't get the rights to find an actor. So anyway, she posed for me. So home charging and then workplace charging. This happens to be a consumer's energy, or in the case of colleges, my daughter went to Rockhurst University in Kansas City and the adjacent University of Missouri, Kansas City. In one of their parking garages, they had EV charging, so workplace, study place, that sort of thing. And by the way, it was free with your parking permit, so it was another incentive. And then you have public charging. By the way, this is a Rivian R1T truck, and this was in Normal, Illinois when I was on a road trip, so this was close to the factory. So there weren't that many of them out there, but now you start to see them. They have these very sort of iconic headlights, and they have an SUV version now as well. How long does it take to charge? One of those number one questions we get also, number one, how far does it go? Number two, how long does it take to charge? Well, there are 3 different charging levels we typically talk about. Level 1 charging is you find your nearest outlet, and there's a cable that typically comes with a car. So you got your 3-pin plug here. There's a little box that does some translation, making sure that everything is grounded properly, that sort of thing. And then you have the other end that goes into the vehicle. And because of the power limitation of a standard outlet, you're going to be charging at about 1.4 kilowatts, 1,400 watts, kind of like a hairdryer, and it's going to add about 4 miles of range per hour of charging. So for a lot of people, that's good enough. My daughter still has a 2015 Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid. She did this for years, charges overnight. I'll talk about what a plug-in hybrid is in a minute. And it's enough. It's enough to do what you need to do. Most people that drive a full battery electric end up going to level 2 charging. So now what you're doing is you're putting one of these high power outlets. It's very similar to an electric dryer outlet if you have one of those. If you're into camping and RVing, the 50 amp plug that you find in campgrounds, that is exactly this. It's called a NEMA 1450, NEMA being National Electric Manufacturers Association. So there are standards for these things. And that's what you use. You plug this is functionally the same thing. It's called an EVSE, Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment. It's not really the charger, but getting into semantics. So now, because of 240 volts, 40 to 80 amps, typically 50 amps, you're getting like 25 miles of range per hour. So now in 10 hours, 250 miles, easily charges most EVs at home overnight. Also very popular at hotels, same kind of reason. You charge overnight, you get enough charge, you have a full battery in the morning. Now, for road trips, still clearly charging in terms of hours is not good enough, so then we have what are called direct current fast chargers. Now, why direct current? All of this charging so far is alternating current. So in other words, I don't know if you're familiar with AC, DC, but AC basically means that you have the voltage, it goes through 60 cycles per second from the peak voltage to the lower voltage, and the battery in the battery in a vehicle, just like in your cell phone, is direct current. There's a plus and a minus. So it's kind of like the little cube that comes with your cell phone. You plug it into the wall. It's alternating current going into it, and then you have a little USB. That's the 5-volt DC that comes out. Same kind of thing. That all happens in the vehicle, by the way, and the vehicle has an onboard charger. And so why am I dwelling on this? Well, there's only so much capacity that AC to DC converter can handle inside the vehicle. So for these kind of power levels, 50 kilowatts, 350 kilowatts, that what's called rectification from AC to DC has to happen off board the vehicle, and then you're just stuffing that power into the car very, very quickly. So now you're talking about, a 20-minute charge time to get you enough to get to the next charger or to your destination. And now, it becomes palatable enough to use the restroom, get a coffee, get a meal, that sort of thing. And this time keeps reducing over time. So now you're getting 500 to 1,000 miles of range per hour. So what do you need for a level 2 home charging setup? So it's a charging circuit. Again, it's very similar to an electric dryer, which means you have, in your breaker box, you have a breaker. It's usually a dual pole breaker, kind of like your air conditioner too, if you have that, or a heat pump. So you'll see the little 2 switches, they're tied together because it's 240 volts. So you need the wire. Why do I call out the wire? Well, 6-gauge wire gets very expensive very quickly. So if you're lucky enough that your breaker box is kind of right underneath your garage, you're lucky because you only have maybe 20 feet of wire. I priced out some wire for a friend of mine who unfortunately is in this situation that his breaker box is diametrically opposed from where he wants to charge in his house. 100 feet, it's about $500 for the wire. So not to be underestimated. And then you have either a receptacle, which looks like this. That's the thing that you plug that EVSE into. Or you have a junction box where it just happens inside a box. You're not plugging it in, and there are pros and cons to both. The one pro of the plug-in version is if you move, you take your whole charging setup with you, dismount it from the wall, take it out. You don't need to have an electrician do any of that. And then we have the charger itself. That's the thing on the wall here. Again, it's really called the EVSE, Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment. And so, yeah, we've already talked about this kind of 7 to 10 kilowatts. Something like this costs about $700, and I'll talk about our programs in a minute, but if one thing I would do is, if you're interested in this, reach out to your utility, whether it's Consumers Energy or Great Lakes Energy or DTE. Almost all electric utilities have programs that will give you a rebate towards the home charging circuit. So in our case, we give you a $500 rebate towards this whole circuit. So basically, you need the circuit itself plus the EVSE. Now, some cars come with a portable EVSE, so you don't need the wall box. So those kind of subtleties, that's why I have a job. I do education and outreach because it's not quite intuitive just yet. And so exactly what you need before you go out and spend a lot of money, reach out to your utility or somebody that knows what they're doing before you, again, spend money on things you didn't actually need. So why is everybody not driving electric yet? Well, I mentioned earlier that there is still a green premium or a premium for electric vehicles over comparable combustion vehicles. So I pulled this out a while back. This is already 2022. This is a Kia Niro. In this case, this is a hybrid. And bottom line price here, a little bit of an eye chart, $31,000 is what they were asking at the time. And then the equivalent electric version was about $42,000, so about a $10,000 premium. And one way that there's help towards that is a federal tax credit. We've gone through several iterations of this. There was an older law that stipulated, it could only, it was based on the number of vehicles that a manufacturer had produced. So the first 200,000 vehicles, after that, the tax credit sunsetted. With the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year, this is a little bit different. There are a lot more vehicles that are eligible now, but it's also based on where the vehicle and some of the components are manufactured. The idea being that we want to try to insource a lot of that, bring back manufacturing to the US. So for example, the Kia Niro no longer is eligible right now because they're all made in Korea, but Kia and Hyundai are scrambling right now to build factories in the US so that they're back in the running. If you're interested in a Tesla, if you're interested in a GM, a Ford, all of those are now eligible for the $7,500 tax credit, so that will take some of the sting out of the initial purchase price. And why the price differential? Well, it all has to do with the cost of the battery. So this chart shows the dollars per kilowatt hour of storage. So back in 2010, 2011, it was about the time where the first Nissan Leafs and Chevy Volts came out. They typically had a battery of somewhere around 24 kilowatt hours of capacity. The Volt had more like 17, and that's because the battery was very, very expensive. So I actually had a 2012 Nissan Leaf, and it had a shocking 80 miles of range, but for me it was good enough. But it was the reason it was had such a low range is because the battery was so expensive. If they had to put what you currently find now, an 80 to 100 kilowatt hour battery in there, that car would have been, much, much more expensive. So as we go on over time, we see that the price per kilowatt hour is dropping, and kind of the holy grail, or that the price parity point that everybody is shooting for, is about $100 per kilowatt hour. And at that point, an equivalent ICE vehicle, an equivalent EV, should have about the same purchase price. The other thing is range anxiety. I'm sure you've heard that term. When you charge at home and you just typically do your daily driving, as I did with my 80-mile range Nissan Leaf, I would drive to work, my wife would take it and take the kids to school, we'd do a little bit of shopping, you go back home, you plug it in, and rinse and repeat. So when you're charging at home, I would argue it's already more convenient than driving a gas vehicle because you never go to the gas station. The only thing you're going to miss is that you don't have a squeegee. You're going to have to buy one of those. And you may save some money on not buying Slurpees and other things when you go to the gas station. Really, range anxiety just becomes an issue on long trips. And when I say long trips, it's anything that's more than the single charge range of an electric vehicle. So at that point, you're going to need to charge somewhere. And then the question, of course, where am I going to charge? How much is that going to cost? We talked about the cost a little bit, but is the station going to work when I get there? And these are the kind of things that we're still struggling with to change that perception. And what we typically find is that range anxiety turns into range awareness. After a while, you know what you can and can't do, how far you can go. You start to figure out in your neighborhood, in your region, where are the chargers. How do I activate them? Do I need special cards or credit cards, or how does this all work? And once you figure that out, you're like, oh, I can do this. So our CEO, Garrick Raschow, I helped him get started with his Ford F-150 Lightning, and then he recently, so it's been about 6 or 7 months now, and he did a video recently with a news outlet, and it's funny because I see the transformation. He's like, oh yeah, well, I go up to Cadillac and I stop in the Meijer and I do a little bit of shopping there, and by the time I'm done and my wife's picked out her food, we have enough charge to get up to Mackinac. So it's not a big deal. So after a while, you get this mindset like, okay, this is not a big deal. This is kind of like buying gas. I can figure this out. So how do you find public charging? Probably the #1 tool, and you can look this up yourselves, called PlugShare, plugshare.com. There's an app that goes with that. It's free. You can download it now. And it shows you all the charging stations that are in the area. Now, there are different color codes for level 2, for DC fast charging. The way PlugShare first got its start is, just as the name implies, from people sharing their home chargers. So if you see little blue houses, those are people's private homes where they've said, I'm willing to have somebody come and charge at my house. And often they don't even want any money for it. The utility of that has kind of gone away because now the public charging infrastructure has been built out to the point where that's almost unnecessary. And I say almost because I've charged at this place right here up in the UP. So I have a Zero electric motorcycle, which has about, actually I have a newer one now that's more range, but the one I had at the time had about 90 miles of range. And I went up, took the Badger across from Ludington to Manitowoc, came up here to the UP, went to Marquette, stayed at a campground, charged overnight at a campground. But this stretch here from Marquette to the bridge is just a little bit too long. And as you can see, there are a lot of little wrenches here. Those are stations that are still under construction, still coming. So there really wasn't that much up there. So I contacted the guy who was behind that little blue icon, a guy named Ivan, and he said, yeah, I just have a cabin and I have one of those NEMA 1450s, the 50 amp outlets. I'm not gonna be there, just plug in, it's fine. And I offered to PayPal him some money and he refused. So, I mean, that's kind of neat that you had the community that does that sort of thing. But as I said, the utility of that is starting to go away. There are other tools. The Alternative Fuels Data Center from the Department of Energy, they have their own site that's independent, so you can look that up, or just Google AFDC EV charging stations. And then the other way to do it is with the charging networks. Just like in the gas world, you have BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, you have charging point operators. One of them is called ChargePoint. You have Electrify America, you have EVgo, that sort of thing. And they all have their own apps, and of course they want to steer you towards their stations. But we're starting to see some interoperability. So for example, there's one called Shell Recharge, Shell as in the oil company, they're getting in the game. And you can activate Shell Recharge stations with a ChargePoint account and vice versa. We're starting to see EVgo is starting to, again, sort of back in the day of roaming, you remember that from cell phones? You go on a different network. They're starting to work together, which is a good thing. Some of the stations also work with credit cards now. A lot of them work with apps, RFID cards. So this is one of those things you learn as you go along. There are also some pretty cool trip planning tools. A lot of vehicles have those built into the navigation. The Teslas are kind of famous for that. So if you plot a course on a Tesla from here to, say, Florida, it will plot a course using Google Maps, but then finding all of their Tesla superchargers along the way and say, okay, you're going to need to charge in Ann Arbor and in Toledo and in so forth, whatever it thinks is the most time-efficient way to do it. And it'll say you need to charge for 15 minutes at this one, 10 minutes at that one, and then you're going to get to 82%, and that's enough to get you to the next charger, and that's the most time-efficient way to do it. But this is a kind of a cool tool, and you can look that up too, A Better Route Planner, or ABRP. You can use that for gas cars as well. The advantage is that they have EVs built into it. So if you say, I have a 2022 Kia EV6, it will figure out what's the range and what kind of plugs you can use and all that sort of thing. So lots of good tools out there. Oh yeah, this is kind of fun too. So PlugShare, one of the things it has is it's kind of crowdsourced in the sense that people will go to those stations and they will check in voluntarily. And they'll say, yep, it works, I got a successful charge, and when you say you have a successful charge, then the rating goes up. So for example, this one here is right near my house, First Street in Muskegon, and it's got this little green number is a number 10, and that's the maximum that you can get. And then people would check in, you see little green check marks, so people have checked in, successfully used it. And if one of the stations goes down and somebody goes there and say, I was unable to charge, they'll put in a negative, unable to charge, the rating starts to go down, and you can look at this and say, you know what, there's something wrong with the station, I'm not even gonna bother stopping there. So that's kind of a useful tool. I wanna talk a little bit about some alternatives, and I wanna go back to hybrids. We talked about combustion cars. So how does a hybrid vehicle work? What is hybrid? Hybrid means you're using putting two systems together. So in this case, a hybrid electric vehicle is one where the drivetrain is electric. So there's an electric motor that's driving the wheels, and there's a small battery that powers those electric motors, but very small. We call that the traction battery, as opposed to the accessory battery. So most EVs and hybrid vehicles still have a 12-volt battery, just like you have in a gas car, but it's not used to crank the car, it's used to run all the accessories and the computer and all that sort of thing. And it's important to have that in good working order, because if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter if the traction battery is at 100%, the car's a brick. So, so you have the traction battery pack, and then you have a combustion engine whose only function is to generate electricity. So now you still have a gas tank, so you fill this up with gas. You notice there's no plug on here anywhere. So you fill this up with gas, the gas engine kicks on, charges that little battery, and when you come to a stoplight or a stop sign, you'll often hear that the combustion engine cuts off, and it's designed to do that. So that's where the energy savings comes from. It'll now shut off, and it uses that little traction battery just to keep things alive. But it only kicks in the combustion engine again when it needs a lot of energy to move the car down the road. And that's how you can get efficiencies of like 50 miles to the gallon, something like that, from a Toyota Prius or the early Honda Insight or something. So the next step is what's called a plug-in hybrid, or PHEV. And so the concept is the same. The wheels are still driven by an electric motor. You still have a combustion engine, you still have a battery, but now this battery, they made the capacity just a little bit bigger. So now maybe instead of 4 kilowatt hours, it's 15 or 20. And the advantage is you can now drive this vehicle for a certain number of miles. My daughter has a 2015 Chevy Volt. It drives about 35 miles on electric power, and then so she can do her errands. And then at nighttime, you plug it back in, and if you have not exhausted the battery, then you can basically run this like an EV. So you get that 3-to-1, 4-to-1 price advantage of driving electric. And then if you go beyond the range of that battery, then the gas engine kicks on, just like a hybrid. It is a hybrid. And then it acts as a generator, and off you go. So the advantage is, for her, for example, the first year we got it for her, she went from August to November and never bought gas. So she calls me from the gas station and said, Dad, I don't know how this works. I'm at a gas station. I've only ever plugged in, right? Because she had advantage of a university house with all utilities included, so she essentially drove for free or included. She just plugged it into a 120-volt outlet every night, and that was enough of a trickle charge to charge the battery overnight. Off she went. And then over time, when she would use a fraction of a gallon, finally got through that 10-gallon tank in November. But now she drove from Kansas City to our house in Michigan. Now it's basically like a gas vehicle, like a hybrid. So you just go to gas stations, the battery stays depleted, it's okay. It's designed that way to be able to run depleted. And then when she comes home again in the summertime or whenever she was visiting us, plug it in again, and then you can use the electricity again. So sounds like the perfect solution, right? No range anxiety, drive electric when you want to. So what's the downside? They're relatively complex, right? So now you have an electric drivetrain, but you still have a combustion engine. So you still have to do oil changes. You still have spark plugs, all that sort of thing. And you know, there are computers running that sort of thing, and every once in a while they need to be rebooted and all that sort of thing. But I mean, then again, EVs are basically driving computers as well. But anyway, the point is that it still has the combustion engine. You still have to take care of that. But other than that, it's actually a very good transition technology. There's some purists out there say, oh, well, we should just go straight EV. But I think there's a place for plug-in hybrids. So what's in it for businesses and municipalities and colleges and workplaces? I would say if you're not offering EV charging, you're missing out on EV driver business. So when I go on a road trip and I look for a hotel, one of the first things I look for is a hotel that has EV charging overnight. And if you go to hotels.com, for example, there is now a filter that says, okay, show me only the hotels with EV charging. And a lot of them are free, some of them are not, because then I have the same experience as charging at home. I plug it in the morning, I have a full battery, and then I don't even have to look for a charging station right away on the first 200, 300 miles of my trip. And also grocery stores. This happens to be the Capital Market in Lansing. They have a couple of level 2 chargers. The Meyer Cascade, 28th Street, does the same thing. They give you 1 free hour of charging. It's kind of like a fuel perks, right? You go there, you charge for 1 hour, you get it for free. If you stay longer than that, it's $2 an hour, which is still quite reasonable, very similar to home charging. So they want you to come. So it's a differentiator. This was in Flagstaff, Arizona. Again, I picked a hotel that was very, very close to EV charging. This hotel here, this is in Lansing again. The Tesla superchargers are close to the hotel, pretty smart. Same thing here, Kansas City. I picked that hotel. So how do utilities get involved? I talked a little bit about the $500 rebate for home charging. We also have something called a smart charging incentive. And the idea here is that we want people to charge off-peak. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Why is that? One of the questions we get is there enough energy available to run all of these EVs, right? So what happens if this disruption takes place and we have all these EVs out there and they all need to charge? Well, what we find is if you look at the time of day demand, there's a curve that this goes through, and there's a peak kind of in the middle of the day, exacerbated, of course, by summer air conditioning, but just even through normal use. You get up in the morning, you turn on the lights, you run your electric water heater, you run your coffee maker, your toaster, whatever. There's a peak there. Also, businesses, businesses like even a convenience store, the first thing to do is turn on all their heaters, their hot dog rolling machines, whatever, refrigerators, of course, well, the refrigerators run all the time. Anyway, there's a peak. That's just what we know through experience. And what we don't want is then people come home at 6 p.m. and they plug in their EVs and boom, they add to that load. So what we typically request from EV drivers, and we kind of sweeten the pot by making it cheaper to charge overnight, is please start charging after 11 p.m. because we know there's not much demand overnight, or much, much less demand. So, so when I talk about this smart charging incentive, what this is if you charge exclusively overnight, starting at 11 p.m. until 6 a.m., we give you an extra $10 a month for 12 months because that's about the amount of time that we have found that it's enough to establish that habit. And it's not like you have to get up at 11 p.m. and go and plug in your car. The way that works is you plug in your car when you come home. Either the car or the charging station is programmed and smart, and it just starts charging at 11 p.m. when the power is the cheapest. And if you need it before then, you can override that function. But that way, it's kind of set it and forget it, plug it in. I know my charging station also has a reminder. If by 10 p.m. it has sensed that I haven't plugged in, it's going to remind me, it says, hey, you didn't plug in your car. You might want to do that. But back to this. So that's the home programs. We also have programs for level 2 chargers for what we call multi-dwelling units or multi-family units. So if you are a condo or apartment owner, that way it gives you a way to charge when you don't necessarily have access to your own electricity. Let's say you don't have your own garage. So we give some rebates for those kind of buildings, hotels, bed and breakfasts, anything with overnight charging. Again, as a regulated utility in Michigan, the MPSC, the Public Service Commission, tells us you really need to push more overnight charging because that will help with grid stability. So we want to do that by helping hotels, bed and breakfast, everywhere there's overnight charging. And then we have a new program for what's called community charging. It's very similar to the multi-dwelling, except maybe the building that is associated with condos or apartments doesn't have a parking garage even. So we want to establish community charging areas where anybody can go and charge overnight, and so that even if you're an apartment dweller and you don't have your own garage, you can still drive electric. And then DC fast charging, you can see there's the amount given is quite a bit more, and that's because the stations themselves are that much more expensive, and that's part of the reason they need to charge a little bit more per kilowatt hour. These are $250,000 installations, which if you look at them in the context of building gas stations cost millions of dollars to build. So, but still, we want to help incentivize that and also do it in a correct way. There's actually a study by MSU that has determined where are the optimal node points, so we don't just get willy-nilly, put charging stations in places that don't make sense. And then, we have special electric rates for EV drivers that are beneficial, again, mostly focused towards overnight charging. And we can do an analysis for people who are considering getting EVs. Is this rate plan actually going to save you money? And we also do fleets, a fleet program. We will do for businesses, we do a fleet electrification study. So if you have a certain number of vehicles, and by the way, a fleet can be a flower shop with one vehicle, one charger, one vehicle, then you don't need a study. It's pretty easy. But if you're an Amazon, or if you've seen some Domino's Bolt EVs running around, they're one of our customers with Power My Fleet. So help them figure out how many chargers do they need, when do they need to operate, and also help with some incentives towards that. And then education, that's me and a couple of my colleagues. We do these kind of seminars. We go to EV shows. September was National Drive Electric Week. It ended up being more like a month. There are EV shows. I'm going to one in Monroe on Saturday. The weather doesn't look that great, but it is what it is. And the way that works is we integrate with the EV community, and we get people that come out and show their own personal vehicles, so that it doesn't turn into a hard sell type situation. We talked about this already, the grid readiness. These are the rates that I talked about. So this is one that's called nighttime savers rate. So I talked about 14 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the overnight rate. And again, the idea there is make it cheaper at nighttime. And what we find is that EV drivers are over 90% compliant with this because they want to save money, right? It's no brainer. Fill up for $10, fill up for $15. You're going to do it when it's cheaper, and it's really not that hard to set up. So what's next for EVs? We're starting to see more non-traditional vehicles, micromobilities. You see the scooters around. You see the e-bikes, right? More vehicle choices. I'm seeing a lot of buzz around low-speed vehicles at the moment, LSVs, almost like golf carts, but ones that are street legal, that are much, much more efficient and also not as expensive. We're starting to see more range and faster charging. So when I bought my 2015 Tesla Model S, a typical charging stop was like 30 minutes. Now it's like 15 or 20 minutes. And the vehicle actually has a smaller battery, and the motors have become more efficient. So it's really, really moving on. This is a picture of me at the tail of the dragon. If you're a motorcyclist, it's a really twisty road in the Smoky Mountains. So there are electric motorcycles, and they're super fun. Highly recommend that. There's a dealer, if you ever want to check it out, if you're a motorcycle rider in Caledonia, down on M37, Boondocks Motorsports. Polaris has brought out a side-by-side, the Kinetic Ranger. It is a Ranger, so if you have a Ranger already, you can use all the same aftermarket parts and that sort of thing. Unbelievable torque, go through the woods, whisper quiet. And then this is what's sitting outside here. So again, if you have a few extra minutes after this, go down between the buildings, check this out. This is an F-150 Lightning. You kind of see it has kind of a weird front grille because it's not a grille. And we have it opened up, it's the frunk. And inside there is a cooler with a drain plug. So you can go tailgating and throw a bag of ice in there and your drinks. And when you're done, it all drains. There are 4 outlets there, so you can run a crock pot. You can run your home if you need to during a power outage, because the energy in that battery is anywhere from 100 to 120 kilowatt hours. And if my math is right, that'll run my house for about 3 or 4 days without even cutting back at all. So this is what we call vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to building, vehicle to load, vehicle to whatever. The point is you have this big battery sitting here, and now let's do some useful stuff with it. For contractors, maybe you're going to run some power tools in the back of your bed. And when you go to check out the truck, there's a power panel in the front, there's a power panel in the back. And so you can do all kinds of stuff. Ford actually has an integrated system. I don't remember the name of it, but basically what it does is it seamlessly integrates your home panel to the car, so that if you have a power outage, it'll act just like a backup generator, so with no interruption, right? Obviously, at some point, the car battery is also depleted, but what we often find is that power outages are regional. So what you could do is power your home. When the car is depleted, maybe you run across town. The recent power outage we had, I noticed Walker, the station, was down because of the power outage, but Cascade wasn't. So maybe you drive across town, charge it for 15, 20 minutes, run back home, run it for another couple days. So this whole idea is, power outage, where do you charge your car? You typically don't have blackouts that are that wide. And this one is a personal favorite of mine. It's a car, well, they call it an autocycle. It's a three-wheeler called the Aptera, APTERA.US, if you want to look it up. And the whole point of that vehicle is it's hyper efficient. I talked about 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour of efficiency. This gets 10. So in the top spec, with a 100 kilowatt hour battery, you have a 1,000-mile range on that vehicle. And they built solar panels into it so that now, if you're an apartment dweller, you can get about 30 or 40 miles of range per day just by leaving it sitting out in the sun. Okay, now, we can talk about weather and whether that works in certain places, but I assure you solar does work in Michigan. So there's all kinds of neat things you can do. And for example, their electric motor is built right into the wheels, or what they call in-hub motors. And now you can use the rest of that space for whatever. Right? So that's all I have formally. Went a little longer than I thought I would, but happy to take any questions. If you want to follow up with me, there's my email address. I do have my own YouTube channel, so you can check that out. I do a podcast. We just had somebody on from Hertz. There's a Hertz rents EVs, so if you want to check it out on 28th Street, you can get a Tesla Model 3 for about $60 a day if you want to just try it out for a day or so. Yeah. Any questions?
I want to use some of the graphs that you have there.
Yeah.
Do we have access to this?
I'll be happy to send. I'll make a PDF or something and send it to Brian. Yes, sir.
I had a question. So, what are your thoughts on the viability of EVs in things like heavy transportation? You mentioned Amazon, but
Yeah.
we're talking like replacing 16-wheelers with EV trucks and maybe even like things the aerospace aeronautical industry, maybe.
Yep, great question. So that's where battery densities is still a little bit of an issue. You may have seen that Tesla, for example, does have they have a semi. And so they recently did a test with a single charge during the day. They were able to do 1,000 miles. That's an area where something like a hybrid fuel cell could still make sense. Nobody's asked me about hydrogen. But since I often get that question, let's talk about it. Well, good. See, I'm ahead of you. No, not really. So the issue with hydrogen is that hydrogen is not a fuel. It is a storage mechanism. Okay? We typically don't drill into the ground and get repositories of hydrogen like we do oil or other fossil hydrocarbons. So you have to make it. So the way it's made today is through something called a water shift reaction. So you take coke, you take natural gas, coke as in steel coke, not the other coke, and then you combine the two of them, you get hydrogen and you get CO2. So it's also not particularly carbon friendly, but that's the way we do it because natural gas is cheap. You can make hydrogen through electrolysis. You basically take water, apply energy to it. The hydrogen-oxygen bond is extremely strong. It doesn't want to come apart. And so you need a lot of energy to pull those two apart. So if you have excess renewable energy, for example, or you put this next to a nuclear plant that has excess energy or something like that, you can do this. You can create hydrogen. Well, you can basically separate the molecule. But now you need to do storage. You need to get the residual oxygen out. As a chemical engineer, you typically have synthesis, separations, and then get rid of the waste, all that sort of thing. So the point is, all of that stuff takes energy. So you get some energy losses. So even if you were to do this from 100% renewable energy, you get some losses. And then from the electrolysis itself, and then you have transport, storage, and distribution, because the place that you make it isn't necessarily where you're going to use it. Right now you need to bring it to a fueling station. And then the reverse is also not, every time you change, energy changes forms, you lose a little bit, right? It's essentially 3 laws of thermodynamics, which paraphrased are, you can't win, you can't break even, and you can't quit the game, right? So you're always going to lose. So the point is, at the end, you have about a 22% what they call well-to-wheels efficiency. And in the right cases for aerospace, or for heavy-duty trucking, or for international shipping, that may very well make sense. But for light-duty vehicles, like motorcycles, like cars, right now, the direct charging with battery electricity is still the efficiency winner. And where you see this playing out, for example, Toyota made a vehicle called the Mirai, and the only way you could get it is to lease it from them. And then you had to go find hydrogen fueling stations in California. And it was very difficult to find those stations, and they also break down, and. So it's not this panacea that some people think it is. It has a role in a sustainable future, in my personal opinion, but you have to look at the efficiency and the use case. Yes, sir.
All right. I have a hard question about cost. Currently in Michigan, the state of Michigan charges about 29 cents per gallon of taxes.
Mhm.
Federal government tax on another 19 cents. So if tomorrow we all stop buying gas,
Mhm.
that is a severely damaging budget line item to the government. So what is Consumers Energy and other for-profit companies' plan for this transition? So if we're really talking, clearly the government needs that money,
Mhm.
right? So right now, I can plug into school's outlet and sort of get it for free, but it's not really free, right? School's paying the cost.
Yeah, it's called theft of services.
Yeah, right. So, and school kind of charges us because they have a technology fee, right? But you know what I mean? So,
Yep.
but if I do it at home, I'm currently, as far as I'm aware, not paying tax on my bill from Consumers Energy,
Not through the energy.
not through the energy, right?
So each state handles this differently. When I lived in Missouri, you had to buy an alternative fuel tag that you put a sticker on your window, and if you didn't have it, you'd get pulled over and get a fine. The way Michigan handles is on your annual renewal tabs. If you have an EV or a plug-in hybrid, there's an extra fee. You pay more. For EVs, it's $140, and if you do the math with a 25 mpg equivalent vehicle, it turns into about 20,000 miles equivalent. So they're already doing it. In fact, the EV community is complaining about that a little bit because you're actually paying more than what the average mileage is. So this idea that EVs don't pay their fair share of road taxes is actually already false. The question is, how do we do it equitably, right? Because you start getting into questions about vehicle weights, right? You know, the vehicles that do the most damage, maybe they are the ones that should be paying more. But also, how does that work if you now drive your vehicle mostly out of state? My in-laws are snowbirds, so they spend 6 months out of the year in Phoenix. So how do you do that? I know when I lived in Pennsylvania some years ago, there was an annual safety inspection for vehicles, and you had to record your odometer reading. So one way could be through an odometer reading. Then you start getting into questions about privacy and how much should the state know how much you're driving and that sort of thing. So the problem is the administration becomes a little bit tedious, which is why the flat fee, although not a perfect solution, is a pretty decent one because you pay it once and you're done. The only question is how much should it be? And if you look at Michigan motor vehicle law, there are provisions for raising that as the gas tax goes up. Right. So for me to renew my Tesla back in the day cost me almost $600. So, which is a little bit of a shock the first time you do that, and if you're not aware of it. But yeah, you're
For people who aren't aware that they're paying taxes at the pump anyways, right? So a lot of
Yeah.
people don't realize that a big chunk of my bill is taxes, and then all of a
Yep.
sudden I'm paying that upfront. So the other
Yep.
question I have is about the sort of model of how Michigan handles utilities. So here, where we're at now is Consumers Energy, and the DTE is around. There's also,
There are other regional utilities, Great Lakes Energy, you know,
so
Grand Haven has them.
we're all for profit, like Consumers Energy is a for-profit company, but also is like a legal monopoly, right?
Right, but we and all the utilities in the state are regulated
By the state.
by the Michigan Public Service Commission. So basically, if we or DTE or whoever needs more money to, I don't know, build a new plant or something like that, we need to make a rate case, and we need to bring that in front of the MPSC, and they need to decide, yes, we're going to let you do that, or we're going to push back. You know, for example, even the programs like these EV programs giving customers $500 towards you know, home chargers, some people might say, well, I'm never going to drive an EV. Why should I have to pay for that? So we have to bring those kinds of cases in front of the MPSC. And yeah, they decide that. So I think there's a certain amount of profit that's permitted, if you will, but it you know, you can't go crazy with it, right? And right now, there's actually quite a bit of discussion with Joycelyn Benson and, you know, about all the power outages and all that sort of thing, because these are also very expensive. The last one, you know, costs, you know, millions of dollars for cleanup. How do you pay for that sort of thing? You know, should we have, you know, we're having discussions about burying more of the wires so that they're not as affected by weather, and more tree trimming, and then, you know, anyway. But yeah, it's a regulated utility. Again, when I lived in Pennsylvania, it was very different. You got one energy bill for distribution from Pennsylvania Power and Light, or whoever your legacy utility provider is, but then you could buy power from Joe's Electricity, or bunnyhuggerelectricity.com, and you ended up with two different bills. You know, do you actually get those electrons? That's another question, right, with interconnectivity. But you had a choice, but there are downsides to that, and some of those we saw what happened in Texas last year, right? So when things go unregulated, what ends up happening is those unregulated utilities tend to have more of a profit motive, whereas if you have a regulated utility, the MPSC tells us you have to have so much in reserves, and you know, you basically serve the people of Michigan, so you need to do things a certain way. So you can argue about whether you like that system or not. So
It's just an interesting model for
yeah,
going from this competitive fuel gas vendors
yeah,
to this sort of commission deciding the cost, right?
yeah.
That's interesting.
And if you've seen, Ann Arbor right now is in the discussions about forming their own utility. And I just saw an article this morning. It's like, maybe it's not as easy as we thought, right? Because building power plants and distribution and maintaining all that is not easy. So.
Very expensive for sure.
Yes, sir.
So I'm downtown here, and there's a lot of these scooters and sort of battery-supported bicycles that have become really popular. But what they do is every night they come and just pulls a battery out, puts a new battery in.
Hmm?
And is there any of that idea in the vehicle where you just,
Yep.
instead of charging the battery, you just swap out a new one?
Yep.
And you
Great question.
build it in a way that it can be just a lot easier to put back.
Yeah. It's a matter of logistics. Okay. If you look up, in Taiwan, there's a company called Gogoro, so Gogo and then RO, and their whole business model is to sell scooters, but as the owner, you don't own the battery. And the way that you change the battery, the way you charge this device is you go to a battery swapping station. So you pay a monthly fee, and you take these, typically two batteries in there, depending on the size of the scooter, one or two. They're about the size of a loaf of bread. The batteries are smart. They know who was last using them. They're networked. You pop them into one of those stations. The system says, yep, these are our batteries. We're going to start charging them, and two fresh batteries pop out and go in. Great. How does that work with cars? So the problem is that the battery on a car is very heavy, and there are companies that have explored doing this. If you look early on, actually Tesla battery swap, you can look it up on YouTube. They did one in about 90 seconds. And the idea was that you would pay about what it would cost for a tank of premium gasoline, and in 90 seconds you had a new battery installed, compared to, at that time, maybe 30 minutes of supercharging. Well, at that time, supercharging was free, included with the vehicles. And what they found is nobody wanted the battery swaps because they knew they had to stop anyway. Okay? Now, there are other companies that are looking into it again. The Chinese EV car manufacturers are looking into that and swapping stations. But then it becomes, again, an issue of who owns the battery. So are you leasing the battery then? And then you can't charge at home anymore. Or can you? Or how does that work, right? And it's kind of like replacing your grill tank. You go and you buy a brand new grill, it comes with an empty tank. You go to Blue Rhino, you get this crappy looking thing. I don't know, am I getting a good battery here? Am I getting a good grill tank? So there are those kind of issues, right? It's not that it's not doable, but then it also, if I own a Tesla and you own a Kia and you own a Volkswagen, are all the manufacturers going to have the same battery packs? So now you're kind of locked into a Tesla charging station or a battery swap station. So it becomes very difficult to manage. It's not that it's not doable technically. Again, it's been shown to be done. They did a side-by-side, gassing up an Audi versus doing a battery swap on a Tesla. You can do it, but again, those issues come up as far as who owns the batteries. Is that part of your lease? Can you still take it home and charge it every night? So those kind of things. For small vehicles, it seems to work very well. And I know Gogoro and some others, they're actually starting to work together. So it's possible, but it's a little bit market driven at the moment.
Yeah, they didn't used to do that. Like I said, they didn't have them where they just pop. So they used to have to take the whole scooter with it.
Yeah.
They just had the battery packs.
Yeah.
It seems to me that that's not much different than having charging stations that have to be the same in order to use that. But anyway, I get it.
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, if you can make it work, and again, Gogoro seems to be doing very well with it, and they're expanding to India and all over Southeast Asia, where the scooter is kind of king. But for here, for the U.S., because we have long distances and things like that, I mean, we're struggling to get EV charging stations out there. Can you imagine trying to put in all these battery swap stations? So.
But anyway,
Yeah.
I totally get it.
Yeah,
We're not
but yeah, you're right. I mean, there are other things that there are benefits to that, such as now you can charge that battery pack that's offline much more slowly. You're not dependent on a 350 kilowatt charger. You can trickle charge this.
Is
So
there any of that currently to where you can charge a separate battery if you yourself swap it out or any of that kind of thing?
not on a car. There are some motorcycles. The Zero motorcycles have some swappable batteries. Again, it's a matter of the actual weight and how.
Being able to pull it in and out easily,
Right.
but they'd have to design it that way.
Right. I mean, there are some that they put a set of wheels on it, so you roll it away, kind of like a suitcase. So there are ways to do it. But then you also need to buy 2 batteries then, right? So they're kind of expensive.
2 tanks of gas, so you ought to be
Yeah, but the battery's a little more expensive yet. So. Yes, sir.
How likely is it that going forward we'll see more EVs with solar panels?
The only reason that the Aptera can work the way it does is because it's so efficient. So because it gets, again, 10 miles per kilowatt hour, the 700 watts of panels that you can fit on the roof will give it enough energy to make a difference. If you just put solar panels on the F-150 Lightning, which gets about 2 miles per kilowatt hour, I mean, you're going to add a couple hundred feet per day just because the vehicle is so inefficient. And my understanding of solar panel technology is we're also just about maxed out on the theoretical efficiency. And we can tweak a few more things. My understanding is that from photons to electrons, you're in the 20 to 30% efficiency range, and we're kind of stuck there. I don't think you're going to see, and even if you did, let's say you got 3 to 1 more, maybe instead of 700 watts, you got 2.1 kilowatts. That's still less than what a typical EV charger runs at. So it's really just a matter of how much solar energy you can get into a certain square area. If you look at, there's some golf carts out there, they'll have, 2 or 3 panels on top, some homebrew jobs, but they start looking kind of ridiculous just because of the surface area that you need for solar. The best way to do it is still to have off-board solar, right? So put solar on your roof of your house. My last house had 37 panels, 10 kilowatts, and now either through being grid tied and I send that energy back to the grid, and then when I need it, I buy it back, or through storage, you can then store that energy and then charge up your vehicle. That's still a little bit more palatable also in terms of cost, because these things are scalable. Also, it's a matter, if you look at the roof here, of course, it's curved. Putting curved panels on is a little bit more difficult. If you go out on Amazon and look for flexible solar panels, they're typically about 2 times more expensive than the flat panels are. So there's some technological challenges there. But my understanding is that at some point you run out of photon to electron efficiency, and it's just not really practical anymore unless you have a very high efficiency vehicle. Yes?
So where do you think EVs need to get to for the average consumer to like choose it over a car they've seen for the last 20 or some years, like a Honda Civic?
Yeah.
Like where does that need to be so that they start to take over the ICE market and they're not like as rare as they are now? even
Sure.
though they're getting much more popular?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So again, it goes back to this this graph of the battery prices. This is really the big driver. So once you start getting the batteries cheaper, then you are at what's called cost parity. And at some point, you could conceivably even be cheaper. The one place that you can already, where we've already sort of achieved this in what's called the total cost of ownership. So Tesla recently dropped their prices again because their manufacturing is vertically integrated. So now they're doing everything from lithium refining all the way up to building the cars. The Model 3, I think, just dropped to $37,000. Obviously, it's not cheap, but if you now, or it's $38,000, because I know with the federal tax credit, it dropped down to about $31,000. And if you look at the operating cost of driving electric versus gas, you have about a 2-year payback, and then it's essentially the same total cost of ownership as a Toyota Corolla. So in that sense, we've kind of already achieved that through the operating cost. Now, once you have cost parity upfront purchase and then it's cheaper to run, it's going to be much more of an argument to, why would you buy a combustion engine? Now, we can still talk about use case. Right now, there's not an EV that will pull a fifth wheel and go 500 miles and pull it up to the UP where there are no charging stations. You just don't have a vehicle out there in the market right now. But in terms of light-duty vehicles, we're getting pretty close. I think the idea at the time was that 2025 was going to be where that crossover was going to happen. The other thing that's happening now is the used market. I don't know about you, but my first car wasn't a brand new car, right? You buy whatever you can get that doesn't fall apart. I had a 1970 Chevette. What a piece of junk, right? But it got me through, right? So one of the things we're starting to see now is that the early Nissan Leafs and the Chevy Volts and all those, they're starting to trickle into the used market. So, I mean, you can pick up a Nissan Leaf probably for about $5,000 right now. The only thing you got to watch now, back in the old days, you did a compression test. You made sure that, somebody had changed the oil. Today, everything is about getting the battery checked out. And there are shops now that will do that for you. So you pay them an hour of labor. They'll check through the battery pack to make sure that all the cells are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's that. There's, again, new cars are expensive, period. I don't know if you've priced a new combustion car lately, but they're pretty darn expensive. So, but as we see more of the electric vehicles coming on the used market, it's going to probably also stabilize the new market.
All right, well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks for your time. And again, feel free to check out the vehicle.